covers media for the Colorado Independent and his own weekly newsletter. He writes about journalism for the Columbia Journalism Review, and he is a contributor to the Washington Post. Currently, he teaches journalism at Colorado College. And the reason why I wanted to have you on, Corey, was to talk about the state of Colorado media. So how are you doing up there in Colorado Springs right now?
I'm okay. I know it looks like I'm in an office, but this is actually my basement. There's a green screen behind me right now. And this is a photograph of an old office I used to work at the Alternative Weekly in Columbia, South Carolina, called the Free Times, about 10 years ago.
Well, let's just start there. Let's start with what's happening for alternative weeklies across Colorado and really across the nation, because I think you know better than anybody that they are going through some hard times. Can't deliver because the places where they used to drop off papers are closed. So what's the state of alternative media in Colorado that most people may not know or realize right now?
Yeah, so during this pandemic, I have been spending a lot of time tracking how it's affected the local media here in Colorado and writing about it for my newsletter and a weekly column at the Colorado Independent. And that's the statewide nonprofit news outlet based out of Denver that itself is changing and transitioning because of this pandemic, which we can talk about later if you'd like. But yeah, as we started with the Alternative Weekly background, that actually is my background as a journalist. I started in alternative weeklies, and it's been really sad to see how COVID-19, the coronavirus, has affected them. The best quote that I saw was in a story, I want to say it was from some alternative weekly, I think in the Midwest. An editor, I believe, noted that the coronavirus was basically like the perfect weapon to destroy alternative weeklies. And why that is because a lot of these publications, well, they're free, and they have been, right? Newspapers can rely on subscriptions and advertising, but alternative weeklies just straight up rely on advertising, and then more recently, in recent years, events and programming. Well, both those things got wiped out during this pandemic, right? The bars and restaurants where alternative weeklies often get a large portion of their advertising revenue aren't open right now. The events that they create to bring in revenue and partnering with local businesses are not happening because people aren't gathering. You could often rely maybe on a large car dealer or something like that for a back page ad. Well, I'm not sure those businesses are essential or not. So you see the advertising get completely wiped out. And the events, I mean, a lot of alternative weeklies, people pick them up to find out what's going on around town. Not much to do around town these days. Right. So it's been terrible to see what's happened at these alternative weeklies. And we can identify them. There are a few in Colorado. So you have Denver Westward, which is owned by a company that has other alternative weeklies around the country, some in Florida, one in Phoenix, some in Texas. That's called Voice Media Group. But the other ones are independent. So Boulder Weekly is independent, and then the Colorado Springs Independent is independently owned, and the Colorado Springs Independent also owns 7 or so other newspapers in the region, some smaller papers that focus on communities like Manitou Springs, but also has the contract, the DoD contract for the military papers. So they might be a little insulated more than some of the others because they have a more diverse portfolio, but they're getting hammered. All of them are. And we've seen them do things differently because of that. They're delivering fewer papers, number one, probably cutting back on their page counts, but they're also now, these free papers have been asking the public, hey, will you just give us money? Almost like the nonprofit model that we've seen over the past decade and a half to 2 decades now, asking for reader support. These are not nonprofits, they're for-profits. But they're saying, look, we need to pay our staff. We don't want to lay them off. Denver Westward's company, they announced that they were going to cut pay for the journalists and the employees there 25 to 35%. The Colorado Springs Independent has said that they're trying to, I think that they kind of promised their employees that they have nothing's going to happen for at least until mid-May or something like that. And then the Boulder Weekly furloughed their sales staff, some other folks, designers, things like that. And that paper, the publisher told me this week that they're applying for one of the PPP Small Business Administration loans, and they hope they get that. So it's a bloodbath out there for local news nationwide, and Colorado is not immune. And that's just the weeklies we're talking about.
Yeah, so let's give everybody a sort of a full view. So that's the weeklies. Let's move into whether we're talking daily print, magazines, and even TV news. What's the situation out across Colorado? That's also a bloodbath. Chieftain has furloughed some reporters. Denver Post and Colorado Springs Gazette are also dealing with this. Give us the full scope of how COVID has impacted daily news production across Colorado.
Yeah, it's basically going to be me giving you a slaughterhouse tour at this point. There's blood on the floor everywhere. You have the large chain newspapers. You mentioned one, that's the Pueblo Chieftain, right? Was owned locally for 150 years, then was bought by Gatehouse, which is one of these kind of hedge fundy operations known to take over a local paper and then gut it. That's now merged with Gannett, so it's the nation's two largest newspaper chains merging, and it's kind of bringing back to mind what happened a long time ago when times were good. These big newspaper companies were gobbling up each other and conglomerating into these giant kind of late capitalist Frankensteins, and it was good for a while when a newspaper could make a large profit margin, like double digits or 20-40% profit margins. But then a few things happened, right? Craigslist came around, they weren't prepared for that. They didn't particularly take the internet seriously as a place where people were going to get their news, didn't react properly to that. And then the recession hit and knocked out a lot of their brick and mortar advertising. Subscription, subscribers were getting older and literally dying. And more people were getting their news on their phones and on their computers. The newspapers didn't properly adapt. So we've seen this kind of shakeout over the past couple decades, and still kind of, I think people in the industry are kind of looking at for what's next. Everybody's trying to figure out, how do you make money with local journalism? It's been very difficult. And in the middle of trying to figure that out, something like COVID-19 comes through, which the industry certainly wasn't expecting, and it's just a knockout blow. And so you've seen these large companies like Gannett and Gatehouse issue furloughs. The Denver Post, which is owned by Media News Group, controlled by a hedge fund out of New York City, the Denver Post laid off 13 employees last week. And you see it happening across the smaller chains like Swift Communications, based out of Nevada, which owns a lot of the newspapers in the mountain towns. I watched one news executive on Zoom talking to his employees recently, saying that they've seen their revenue drop by 50% and predicted that it could go as low as bad as 75%. Essentially told staff business as usual is not going to be what it used to be even when we're out on the other side of this. So what comes out of this, when it ends, we have no idea, but it's certainly accelerating the decline that was already happening at the local news level, particularly when it comes to print.
But that brings up an interesting point, because there has never been another time needed to track how COVID-19 is working through these communities, to work how local leaders and even Jared Polis across the state, keeping them honest. There was some controversy with Jared Polis and the state not releasing certain numbers, such as what's the rate of spread in retirement communities or things like that. So walk us through how a local community can balance transparency and keeping the leaders honest, not just with the health crisis, but with the coming the crisis to the economy that's going to come in the next 3 or 4 months, and not having the bodies in the newsroom to do it. How do you balance this out?
I mean, you see it's being tried. I mean, the journalists are doing as much as they can, right? These journalists, especially, it's a really cruel irony. What's happening is that at a time when you need local journalism more than ever, you're going to get less of it because of what's happening, right? If the primary purpose of journalism is to provide citizens with the information that they need to be free and self-governing, that's going to happen less when you have fewer journalists out there being able to do it. Also, while the governor of Colorado has made the news media an essential business, meaning that journalists can go out outright and do their job, and they don't have to stay home. A lot of them are, right? So there are ethics involved in deciding to what extent you go do that, right? And we've actually seen, Susan Green, I think at the Colorado Independent, had a piece about what it was like just kind of going out and checking in on people who were out. Westward's Michael Roberts did a piece where it was like right before the stay-at-home order came in Denver, where we went out and wanted to see how many people were actually out there. Maybe it was right around the time it happened, to try and get a sense of the extent to which people were following it. Interesting, some impact in Colorado Springs. A local TV station found out, or had heard, that the large hotel here, the Broadmoor, which is owned by the same person who owns the local daily newspaper, the Gazette, wasn't perhaps didn't shut down its restaurants or something. And so they went and checked that out and reported on it and investigated it. And then the hotel did shut down its restaurants, which leads me to the Gazette is an interesting situation. The Gazette is not, as far as I know, laying off reporters or furloughing reporters. And that's because it's owned, I think, it's because it's owned by a billionaire. There's a lot of complications and conflicts that come with having a billionaire owner, but we're seeing how kind of the ownership structure of local news is reacting to this kind of thing. And then that's kind of one outlier in the situation, is that that's a newspaper that, has at this point anyway, not laid off staff, not furloughed staff. And it's not to say that every single news outlet out there in Colorado has. We don't know what we don't know. Some of the news organizations are being pretty transparent with their readers and saying, here's what's happening to us. Last Sunday, I think it was, or there may be the Sunday before. It's now, I guess we're 4 weeks into this thing that I've been following it here in Colorado. I noticed a lot of little boxes on the front pages of newspapers, usually from the publisher or something, saying, hey, here's what's going on. Here's how it's affecting us. And we need your help.
But it brings up a point that COVID-19 might have been the accelerator, but it wasn't it's not the reason why local news is broken. Local news, would it be fair to say, was broken before? TV stations are making money off 24 hours of programming. Some of that's entertainment programming. So they're not just making their money off their news. Radio stations, at least public radio stations, have generations of a giving foundation so that they can at least sustain that. Colorado Public Radio and local public radio across the state. But in the sense that the customers paying for news is not like it was in 1997. Something has fundamentally shifted in the last 10 years, and there's been no replacement of sort of a strategy to get those people back. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about the local news isn't broken, right? The business model is, and folks involved in trying to figure out how to fix this business model have really not been able to crack that code. I often say, though, that if you want to look at some of the worst things that are happening around the country when it comes to the business model at local news, you can look to Colorado, because we have these hedge funds that have just been pretty awful when it comes to newspaper ownership. We have some bright spots, though, right? Colorado Public Radio is probably the brightest spot in Colorado, in that it was, up until recent weeks, the only really large expanding newsroom that's rapidly growing, right? And they're doing the public media model. COVID-19, though, has chilled their hiring. They're not hiring right now, even though they were before, until all this is over, I guess. Rocky Mountain Public Media is another one on television that's actually doing pretty well. They're creating this new building, and we can talk about what they're going to do with that. It's called Collab, and that has accelerated collaboration among newsrooms in Colorado. But television stations, again, like think about, so Tegna is a large local TV company, and it owns 9 news in Denver, probably one of the most watched news TV stations in that metro area. They got hit with cutbacks too, right? TV news gets a little more when it comes to the business side, gets a little more than digital news or print news. Bloomberg, think about how much Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer just dumped into those TV stations. The problem is that money typically probably doesn't stay at the local station to hire new reporters. It probably goes, up and loaded up onto corporate balance sheets somewhere. But to your point about COVID-19 and the coronavirus accelerating what's happening and kind of forcing people to do things differently, I do think that's what we're seeing right now. And specifically with the for-profit outlets that are asking for reader support now, asking for money. Aspen, I think, is a pretty interesting place to look at right now when it comes to that. You've got Aspen Journalism, which is a nonprofit that collaborates with the local news around there to do kind of investigative and public service journalism work, largely around water, things like that. They've been asking for reader support for a long time. They disclose their donors. They say when they got the donation, how much it was, who gave it. But now they're competing with their fundraising with the Aspen Daily News. I don't know if Vail Daily's doing this, maybe the other Aspen paper, but those are free papers that are now saying, hey, readers, we need you to chip in, and will you do it? I'm interested to see to the level that those newspapers disclose who's funding them, since readers have long wanted to see that from the nonprofits. So you get into these kind of ethical issues. So another one is government support. There are some newspaper publishers who probably say, no, we're not going to try and get our hooks into some of this stimulus money if it's available. And some news outlets are probably thinking, yeah, that'd be pretty good to have.
But it brings up, in terms of the fundraising model, asking people for money, it brings up a problem, 2 problems. And we've already seen this happen in Denver, where 5 outlets are asking for a monthly donation versus maybe 20 years ago, people would just give that money to the Denver Post. So a lot of everybody's trying to go for the same pot of money from that 1 or 2 individuals that give money to these outlets. And the prices can be, if you're paying $10 for Netflix, but $50 to support 5 outlets, that's an expensive in Denver, that kind of makes it a more affluent game is who's supporting news, rather than this wide subscription base that local newspapers used to be. Everybody subscribed to the paper. At least you could go to that little metal box on the corner, put in a couple coins, and get a paper out that day. So how can the consumer support news and not see their budget blow up when they're also hurting right now? Because is there anybody that's sort of see the early signs of not over asking and not over stressing their donors?
No, that's a good point. I'm not sure. What is pretty clear is that these news outlets that are asking for reader support are seeing more traffic than they have seen in a long time, right? You hear these editors, Larry Rickman, he's the editor of the Colorado Sun, which is the public benefit corporation that relies on primarily now, I think, reader support. And he was on the radio recently and said that they haven't seen this much traffic in a long time. And just as at the time when they're seeing as much traffic, they're also getting memberships. They rely on reader support through different kind of tiers of memberships. And I think he put out a letter or a tweet or something recently saying that they had like hundreds of new members. So some of these news outlets are being able to capitalize on the, and they're also, hey, guess what, doing really good journalism too, right? So if the public is getting what they want and what they need from this, yeah, they're going to have to chip in, and they're being asked from everywhere. They're being asked from their local newspaper, their public radio station. But that's not too new, right? I think the folks trying to figure out how the business model works for local news have been trying out a lot of different initiatives, and there's groups and foundations and media thinkers all over the country trying to find the best model. And one thing you hear from a lot of them is that you know, your support for the news should just kind of be built into your budget. Pay what you can afford, and you know, whether that's public radio, new media, newspaper subscription. I would love to print out my monthly statements and go through with a highlighter to see how many that, you know, I donate to now, and I probably can't even keep up with them, like reading them, consuming them.
And there is an interesting, I guess, sort of the haves and the have-nots here. The ones that you've all described are all Denver-based. Colorado Sun, Colorado Public Radio, which has gone to a statewide model, but they're based out of Denver too. The Collab is another Denver project trying to do statewide. And then Aspen. So what do you tell a local paper in Trinidad, Alamosa, Gunnison, Grand Junction, Craig, Greeley? I mean, how many more cities do, if the voice of Colorado news is weighted in Denver, and that's not to say that Denver can't cover local, the four corners of Colorado, but that doesn't mean that local journalism is saved. It means Denver out of journalism is saved. So what do you do in these counties that are losing their local voice?
Right, that's a good point. And I think what we saw just this week with the Colorado Independent, and, you know, full disclosure, I write for the Colorado Independent. That's where my media column appears each week, and I've covered politics and public affairs for them for the past 5 years about. They just announced that what they're doing, so they're joining this Collab effort that you mentioned, which is a collaboration of a dozen or so newsrooms. Are you part of it?
I've seen it. I'm not joined in on that yet. No.
Okay, so it's a collaboration of a lot of these outlets that you mentioned. There are, I think, some smaller ones out there. I think the Pagosa paper is part of it. I can't name off the top of my head some of the others. But I'll circle back to your point. The Colorado Independent is it is a Denver-based nonprofit. It has, the editors have said like they want to tell the story of Denver, but it's also statewide. Covers large statewide ballot measures whenever there are elections, things like that. But now they are going to shift to be more hyper-local out in these areas of the state that we call news deserts, where there's only one small weekly or monthly paper covering it, no TV station or radio station maybe. And they're going to try and be strategic about getting into those communities and helping where they can, partnering with the local newspaper, I think, and helping them on large, high-impact investigations and that kind of journalism. You saw them do this already with a paper called the Rio Blanco Times, where Susan Green teamed up with the editor, Nikki Turner, there for a really impressive series called Through the Cracks. And I think they saw a need for that elsewhere, and they wanted to see how they could help, and their transition will be to try and do that. That's one. Are there other initiatives out there that I don't know about? Maybe, but should there be more? Yeah, absolutely. Look what you're doing in Pueblo, right? This is new. We're talking on this television. Now you have a television show now. Would you have done this had not, this whole thing happened?
I don't know if we would have. Well, we had planned to do this a part of when we were going to change our models.
It's a weird time to talk about it right now too, because this isn't the time. I mean, this is what we're talking about now is something that, people have been debating in Colorado and elsewhere in the country now for years. And a lot of it has to do with just where we are with our economic system right now. And I think it's a fair question to ask whether where we are in our, kind of late capitalist system it's not working for funding local news. And we're not going to figure that out now, right? We were trying to figure that out. Then this happened. Where it what it looks like when this is all over. We don't even know when that's going to be. I mean, we're going to have to come back and have another 2-hour show for that.
Don't you think that the silver lining is forcing a lot of newsrooms to just go, heck with it. We got to try something now and just see if it works?
I do think, I think we're seeing that. You can put a value judgment on that. I will tell you, so somebody, an Associated Press reporter here based in Colorado, was asking for positive, like, I'm just looking for silver linings, right? Show me some positive news about the coronavirus. And the only thing that I could think of when it came to what I've been looking at is kind of how the impact of this virus on the media ecosystem. There is something interesting that happened in southern, the Four Corners area of Colorado. La Plata County and Montezuma County are called orphan counties. For decades, folks who subscribe to satellite TV providers, when they turn on their TV to get local news, it comes from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And a lot of them are really frustrated about that. I mean, people in Albuquerque are like, oh, they just want to see Broncos football, but that's not true. Some of them do, right? But if you look, and I did, look at the FCC file and see all the letters for a long time that residents have been sending to FCC saying, look, we don't even, we never see news about our own state on TV. It's always about New Mexico. We want to know what's going on. There's an election coming up. I interviewed a woman who told me she thought the governor of Colorado was running against the name of the governor who was in New Mexico, because that's what she saw on television. So for years, I'll get to my point in a minute, sorry. But for years, people in those counties, those urban counties, have been complaining they can't see Colorado news on their TVs. There was a movement to change that. Parts of Colorado's congressional delegation have been trying to fix that. Our new Attorney General, Phil Weiser, wanted to do something about it. He's a telecommunications attorney, so he kind of had some access to the folks up in DC to do something about it. And the FCC did change its rules to allow Denver programming into La Plata like months ago. Nothing happened. But after the pandemic hit, the congressional delegation kind of leaned on the private broadcasters in Denver, and they did say, okay, we're going to start putting Denver news down into that part of the state. So we are seeing a lot of things happen because of this that might not have happened otherwise. That's just one.
The other thing I would ask about is this, and journalists hate when you ask this question. Does what journalists produce have to change?
I think journalists should always be rethinking how they're doing their jobs, right? And asking themselves what the reader needs, what the community information needs are, how they can best meet them. One thing I wrote about last week is this new initiative that was kind of ramped up or accelerated because of the pandemic, called Collab, which is this collaboration of a bunch of news outlets that are getting together. And one of the reasons I talked to somebody behind this thing, and one of the reasons they said they wanted to do it and do it now, this was in the works for a while, who knows when it was going to happen, was that they wanted to kind of tamp down on duplication. And they said they didn't see too much of it, but there was enough of it that they thought, hey, let's get these news outlets who previously used to compete to the extent that they're willing to do it, show everybody else what they're working on. And if that outlet is working on the same kind of story, well, maybe both of us don't need to do it. Acknowledging that the reader now can, what you were describing is the kind of a la carte model, whereas you're not just picking up a newspaper and looking at everything in it, but you're saying, okay, I'm interested in this, so I'm going to go to this outlet to get it, or I'm interested in that, or I'm going to search for this, or I get this through my Twitter stream, or however. But to your original point, of course journalists are going to be constantly and consistently rethinking how they're doing things. And then, this is just an unusual time, right? And so you're seeing a lot of the news that you were describing is, it's going to be about this and how this particular thing is impacting their community, but that's not the only thing being covered.
What burden, two last questions. What burden does an entity like Facebook and Google have to support news outlets now, since they've made a lot of their money off the stories and links? Do they owe something to these publishers? Because and journalists to sort of backfill the hole, because they made billions of dollars off the links and stories and sold ads against that content. So do they have a burden to backfill this? And is anybody pushing them to sort of release the funds that they have?
Yeah, I think they acknowledge that. I sure hope they do. I can't speak to the extent that they're doing it. I know they are. So Google does something called the Google News Initiative. Facebook has something called the Facebook Local News Project, something like that. Colorado has actually benefited from that. Just last week, 8 newsrooms in Colorado announced they each got $5,000. Part of it came from Facebook's initiative. Google is doing similar things like that. Are they trying to buy their way into heaven because they hurt democracy by trying to make as much money as they can as fast as they can and hurt the local news industry? They could do what Craig Newmark is doing, right? Craig Newmark is who founded Craigslist. I've never talked to him about this, but he has to know that Craigslist inadvertently hurt newspapers really badly. Well, what's Craig Newmark doing these days? He's funding journalism schools. He's funding he's funding journalism projects. Should Google and Facebook put up some money to this? I think they are. And I think it's good to kind of track and see how they're doing that. I do know that news outlets in Colorado are benefiting from it.
So the last question that I would ask you is, let's fast forward a couple months. Who survives out of this?
I can't say. I wish I wish I could. I don't know. I really don't know. You're asking. Well, I think what you're asking me is, given all the discussion we've had throughout this whole conversation, the different kind of news outlets that we've discussed and their ownership structures and how they're dealing with this, when it all shakes out, which ones are still standing and what do they look like? I have no idea. I look forward to tracking it and covering it through this process. And let's you and I get together after this and see then. I can't make that prediction. No idea. I don't know. I just don't know whether everyone's going to go back to work in 3 months or a year. Man, I have no idea. I'm concerned there will be fewer reporters. I'm concerned there will be fewer news outlets. I can't imagine that's a good thing.
But in this one industry, it's sort of like the jobs are being cut as the demand increases.
Yeah.
And so as we get into May or June, some will survive, some may not. But do you see that the coverage of COVID-19 has been hampered or hurt by the lack of journalists?
It has been hurt by the lack of journalists. There are fewer journalists out there doing journalism on a daily basis than there were 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. We have no idea what the coverage would look like if you had all those people here, but it's just not the case. And as I say, it's going to get worse as the weeks progress, right? So journalists are now, I just saw a local journalist tweet right before I got on this program, how, it was no fault of her own that she's furloughed today, right? Not producing journalism. And she can't help but feel guilty about that. It's a really sorry state of affairs.
Well, on that note, we'll look in the next couple of weeks and see what happens. Is there? I'll leave you with this question. In an age when we are in a national pandemic and local journalism is needed more than ever, what gives you hope that the industry can find its footing again?
I heard somebody once say that journalism will outlast its institutions. And I'm going to have to fall back on that. The journalism that's been coming out on this, whether it's at the national level or the smallest local news outlet that's scrambling out there to provide the community with the information it needs right now, is they're all doing that, right? They're working harder and longer and cranking out more stories and doing it to a level, at least here in Colorado, that I'm reading of a really good quality. And I think that's such a need that it will survive. What the institutions look like that support that and let that happen, no idea. And you and I will talk about this when we're on the other side.
And on that note, Corey, appreciate you coming on and talking through the bloodbath that's happening across Colorado. I don't think there's one outlet that's not impacted by this, or one journalist. So we'll look to see what happens, I guess, in the next few months.
Yeah, keep doing what you're doing down in Pueblo.
Stay safe up there. We'll circle back and see who survives.
All right, take care.
All right, thanks, Corey.